I want to just welcome you to this Leadwell Accelerator. My name is Greg Ligon, and we're going to be talking today about succession and some of the challenges and tensions that are a part of succession. I've been worked with Leadership Network for a long time and have had my own organization, Ligon Group, now for a few years, and I've enjoyed continuing to work with churches and leaders in coaching and consulting. Earlier this fall, I hosted a group of 50-something senior pastors, age, not the number of people, from great churches that are going and growing and innovating in this season. They're very much engaged in the here and now in their church. None of these leaders were a part of the Great Resignation crowd. But they also were all folks who were beginning to explore, dream, think about, evaluate, what's it going to look like beyond this season, and how do they finish well in the context of this last season as in the lead pastor role. They were really asking the question, how do I serve with strength where I am while I plan for what's next? Well, in one of the calls leading up to that cohort gathering, a conversation about some of the tensions of the season surfaced, and included amongst those tensions were identity, focus, timing, in or out, move or stay, and preparation. Jim Collins has a quote that says, "True success is in many ways demonstrated by an effective transition." Easy to say, not as easy to execute. And so today we have the privilege of having three senior pastors that are going to be joining us today. They've all recently completed the handoff to the next senior leader in their churches. And today we're going to be having some conversations with them about how they managed those transitions and the tensions that were a part of that. We have Steve Stroop from Lake Point Church. Steve was at Lake Point for 40 years in the lead pastor role. They have 6 locations. We also have, and I'm going to refer to him as Stroop because we have 2 Steves today. Steve Poe was at Northview Church, 13 campuses, was there for 23 years. And just recently has handed off the reins to his successor. And then finally, Bob Merritt from Eaglebrook Church. He served that church for 29 years, and they currently have 10 campuses. So we've got some great leaders and great experience you're going to have the opportunity to glean from today. This is how we're going to work today. I'm going to be interviewing the guests around the 6 succession tensions. And as they speak, I want you to be sure and post your questions in the Q&A. In the chat. And as we come to the times for Q&A, we'll be going and looking at those questions and bringing those into our conversation. Finally, before we get started, I want to note that we have as our guest as well, Matt Steen. Matt's the CEO of Chemistry Staffing. I've known Matt and his partner, Todd Rhodes, for many years in my work at Leadership Network. But now they have an organization called Chemistry Staffing, and they are a staffing organization committed to connecting great churches with great staff. And we'll hear more about that a little bit later in the show. But let's get started. I want to jump into the first tension, and the tension of identity. And I'm just going to have Stroop. Why don't you hop in first and share a little bit about kind of what were the tensions for you as you navigated from being in the lead pastor role and then moving toward passing that off to Josh, your successor.
Yeah, I really I'm fortunate in that I did not have a lot of my identity wrapped up into the particular role of lead pastor. It was more an identity of helping people. And I've had a consulting side gig for a long time. And so I didn't so much leave the lead role as I went to go to do more consulting. And one of the things that Bob Russell says in his book, Transition Plan, is that you don't need to just be leaving something, you need to be going something. And it's probably something you're already good at. There's a reason, you are in the job you were in for all the years that you were in. And where could you use those same gifts and those same talents, understanding how God made you to continue to have an impact in a different season? And so for me, I was blessed. That was a fairly easy transition because I'd already had one foot in that world. And so it wasn't that I was experimenting in that. And so I was, as much as I enjoyed the 40 years of pastoring here, I'm enjoying even more. I've had the luxury of going more into who God made me than I actually was able to do during the 40 years while I was pastoring.
Hmm, that's good. Bob or Steve Poe, anything you would add to that?
Yeah, over the years, you hear your job shouldn't be your identity, and I just don't know how that's possible. I mean, this job consumed me day in and day out, every part of my life, and so being a pastor, being a teacher, leader of this church, really was a huge part of my identity. I got to tell you, Steve's done a better job, probably Poe, or not Poe, but Stroop just talked about how he had some other things going on in his life. I really didn't have anything going on in my life other than trying to survive this church. So when I stepped down, I experienced huge loss, and actually I'm still dealing with it 3 years later. It's really a daily battle for me, I would say, Greg, and to you guys, that you try not to let your ego be a part of that. But I mean, I've got an ego, and I have to wrestle that down almost every day. So yeah, I'll just leave it at that. But it's an issue that has to be dealt with. I can just say it that way.
Yeah, certainly there's some transition associated with that. Steve Poe, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to.
Yeah, Greg, I would agree with that. I'm only into this 1 month. I actually retired November 15th. So this is all brand new to me, and I'm very excited, about the next chapter that God has for me. And I'm looking forward to the things that I'm going to be doing. But I was taken by surprise, the grief that came with walking away. I really didn't think I would have any. And I was pretty overwhelmed the last 60 days before I stepped aside. And even into the first 30 days, this retirement, it's been hard. It's like, you've built something and it's like your daughter. It's like your family. And to step away from it, it's not that I'm convinced it's God's timing. I'm convinced I did exactly what God told me to do. And I'm convinced that I'm going to love this next chapter, but it doesn't make it any less hard stepping away from what you've known and loved for so many years.
That's good. Good word. We had David Ashcraft from Lives Changed by Christ was with us back in the fall too. And he described the Sunday that they drove to the church, he and his wife. It was actually the Sunday that they announced it to their church. And he said they looked at each other and said, it feels a little bit like we're going to our memorial service. And so certainly that grieving process is certainly a part of this. And I think sometimes takes leaders by surprise. Want to say, Matt, why don't you jump in too? Matt Steed, I know this is one of the things that you guys have talked quite a bit about. And what are some of the things you've observed as you've worked with churches and leaders in terms of kind of identity issues as they navigate this season?
Yeah, I think what we've experienced is very much what Bob and Steve Poe have shared. I mean, we as pastors, we like to say that my identity is in Jesus and not my job. But I think, if we're honest with ourselves, we know better, right? This is not profound. So, the analogy works for me. Hopefully it'll work for you. I look at church kind of through the lens of Starbucks, right? If you're familiar with Starbucks, they have $17 cups of mediocre coffee, but what they say they're trying to do is market the third space, right? First space is your home life, second space is your work life, third space is your community life. And so you drink your mediocre coffee that's overpriced, in a fake living room, but that's what they're trying to do, right? When I talk to churches as they're preparing to go through this process, it's just a reminder that, ministry people, we don't have the luxury of three distinct spaces. When we go through transition, it is every single space is being disrupted. Our community life, our home life, our work life, it is all being disrupted. And it's up here, that makes a lot of sense, but we all know the distance between up here and our heart is so far. And it takes a good bit of work to get that into our heart where we're truly ready for that. Right. And so my encouragement to guys that are going through this process as we walk with them is, start spending the time now. It probably needed to start a year ago, but start spending the time now to get into a place where, where Stroop is, and has something to step into to help with that mourning and grieving process that is going to hit in and give you something to wake up excited about instead of remembering what it used to be. Because this is going to be one of the toughest decisions that you make in your ministry life. I'm going to start preaching if you don't cut me off, Greg.
Okay, let's move on. I want to move to the tension of focus now, and the tensions that were articulated with the guys around this one were, in my role as lead pastor, where do I, in this season of kind of preparing for handing off to the successor, where do I focus on the church and where do I focus on me or focus on what's next? What did that look like for you? I know, Steve, it sounds like you were able to, not that you were, in no way am I suggesting that anyone, was not performing the responsibilities, but in terms of really beginning to create space for thinking about what's next. What did that look like for each of you? Steve, you've already articulated a little bit that, you were already doing some of the things that you're doing now that you love along the way. But were there things you did during that kind of last period to kind of get ready to do that on a more full-time basis?
Yeah, I think guys start thinking about it. What I'm hearing is they don't think about it soon enough. When I turned 60, I actually made the transition at 67. When I turned 60, I came to the elder board and said, hey guys, it's not imminent, but if we have a longer runway to prepare for this, I think we'll do a better job and we'll have more options. And so let's hold this real, and I know I'm kind of getting into timing here a little bit, but let's hold it loosely and we'll put it in pencil. I can extend it. You guys can extend it or, truncate it. But let's start talking about what that looks like. And part of what that did is that allowed us to have time. Again, I'll quote Bob Russell in his book, Transition Plan. He says, people stay on too long because they haven't prepared financially, and they stay on too long because they don't have something to go to. And so by starting that conversation early, I think you can begin to prepare your heart a little bit better. It's kind of like when mom or dad dies, though. You never prepared for it, even though they've been sick for a while. But you can kind of begin to acclimate to it, and you can begin to make some plans about your future. And the church can have a longer runway to not only find the person to replace you, but also take care of you financially so that you can leave and have more options because you are financially secure. I do think it also gives you time to clean up your campsite before the next guy comes in, which I think is real important.
That's good. We'll talk about that in just a second. I want to come back to that. Bob or Steve, what were some, I know what you're going to say, Bob. Steve, talk a little bit about what both of you, I'd love to hear kind of what you did. Did you do anything in preparation during that last season for what's next? Or were you just kind of totally head down, focused on the church?
Well, I would say I was certainly in prayer about what God had for me next. I had, I'm passionate about a lot of things in the kingdom. And so there was a lot of things on my list that I wanted to explore. But at the same time, I felt like it was important that I didn't take my foot off the gas at the church. Because I told my wife, I said, this is my legacy. And I don't want them to remember my last 6 months as doing nothing. I want them to see me full speed ahead all the way up to the last day I walk out of the building. And so I focused on that, concentrated on that. But at the same time, I certainly was praying about, God, where do you want me to serve you in the next chapter? And as I've discovered already, there's plenty of things to do in the kingdom. It's now just trying to determine which ones does God want me to do, and what passions has he really given me?
Bob, I'm going to turn the question a little bit different for you. And in that period, were there any things that you felt like were really important to focus on to help prepare your successor? Were there any kind of initiatives that you went through? Were there any kind of those kinds of things that were important to focus on in preparation for the next guy?
Are you throwing that to me, Greg?
Yeah, I am. Sorry.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it took me 2 years to clean stuff up. And honestly, I had to fire a couple of people, and they were my fault. I'd brought them on, and especially one particular senior level staff. I knew he had to go, and I wished I could have passed that to somebody else, but that was my deal. Had an epic battle with the chairman of our church, who was a new chairman. I actually seated him, didn't vet him well enough, and it grew into a firestorm my last year. And I tell you those, and I had to, it was first time in 29 years that I had to ask a board member to resign. And I had another board member with me, and it was just a firestorm after firestorm of things that I had to clean up, but also build into my successor. I became just a maniac in terms of trying to hand everything off to him, and wrote up a few documents, had some meetings with him, and just pouring into him as much as I could, trying to set him up as best as I could for the next season in his life. So I don't know if I can say this, balls to the walls, I guess, those last 2 years. And I fully embrace what Stroop is saying. You know, he had this thing planned out ahead 7 years in advance. I didn't do that. I was too late. And especially with regard to the financial piece of it, I was way too late in the game on that. And that was part of the firestorm I had with our chairman and our church board. So that's a critical piece. When I pulled the plug March 1st, 2020, I was so tired. It took me a year to recover. I mean, I checked out. It was COVID. I sat on the back of my deck drinking coffee every morning, just glad to be done.
I'm glad it was just coffee you were drinking, Bob.
So I did some things. I didn't do it well enough and wasn't really prepared. But I will say this: I think even if I was prepared to do something else, it would still be a great loss.
Sure.
And I would still grieve it.
Yeah, and I'll add this to what Bob is saying, is I had to deal with some staff issues that I had put off. And I think the fact that retirement or that transition was coming set a deadline for me.
So okay.
And so, because you put those things off, because it takes a lot of emotional energy, to Bob's point. And, you're preaching every week, and you're dealing with new initiatives and everything. And so when I had that deadline, I finally said, hey, I've got some high maintenance. I actually had some high maintenance, but worth it staff members, but I wasn't going to lay those on Josh. I was going to solve those issues before he came aboard. And but what Bob is referencing too, in terms of the financial piece, guys, that's something that a longer runway really, most of us started off underpaid. And when we're coming in the home stretch, the church needs to make up that difference and catch us up on the sacrifices that we made. All one of these guys could say the same thing. I turned down raises because I knew the church couldn't afford it and we needed other staff members. And when you get that home stretch, they need to do some unusually generous things. And they're not only helping the guy who's leaving, they're helping the church to get, to move into that new season. And so the quicker you can deal with that, and there's a couple little hacks that I'll share later on if we have time, in order to get there quicker.
Greg, let me just add this real quick. Yeah. I totally agree with both of them. I didn't have a runway financially. You make all these sacrifices. And then when we came down to the very end, the last year, and they tell me what they're going to do, it was not good. And so it created a great deal of tension between my board and myself. We did, in the end, work it out, and they did take care of me. But I realized, and I owned it with them, when I said, you know what, guys, this is on me. I should have had you address this 4 years ago. We should have been talking about this. And it would have been a whole lot less pressure and tension on everybody.
Good. I'm going to move to some Q&A, and we've got a couple of questions that have come in, and one that specifically relates to this. Question is, were any of you involved with choosing your successor? And what cautions would you have for those of us beginning the succession where the elders have asked you to be a part of the search process? I think all of you were heavily involved in the selection process. Any cautions that you would have with reference to how to manage that?
The quick thing I would say is that I know the job better than anybody else. And I've hired more people for this church than anybody else. I was the best person to find my replacement. Now, obviously, I would want the elders to affirm that decision. They had veto authority over it, but it just made sense to do that. There's no question that just like any other staff member, your safest staff, your safest choice there is an internal candidate. We tried to raise up an internal candidate and it just didn't work for us. And so we finally had to go outside of the church, but it was somebody I knew very, very well from coaching them for a very long time. And so that's the greatest danger, is that if you have to go outside of your existing staff and there's not an apparent heir apparent inside, you know, there's a risk. And there is no more important hire than you've ever made in your tenure there than the one to pick the guy. I think there's some great tools out there. And we utilized all those tools. And if you're going outside, I think you have to date them for a long, long time in order not to make a mistake there.
Yeah, so I was lucky. We were able to hire, my successor was my 12-year long teaching pastor, still young. He was 41 when we took over. But the church loved Jason. They knew him. He was the obvious choice. The church board was still, they were the hiring, or, you know, they were the hiring mechanism. So they had to agree. And then, so it was fairly seamless, but Jason had to go through some vetting with them, and he had to answer some questions and fill out some, you know, vision statements and do some things to prove his leadership muscle. But he was the obvious choice. I can tell you, these guys, if you don't have a successor in mind and you think you're close to it, you know, within 5 years or so, man, that's got to be front and foremost on your thinking, because they are hard to find.
Yep.
We tried to find my replacement through the mechanisms that are out there, and you guys know what they are. We couldn't find them, and we took 2 years to try to find a person. Finally hired an outside, Brian Leake from Dallas, who flies in to speak, and that he's still doing that for 3 years. He's been doing that to offset. It's just, they're just hard to find. So if that's not on your radar, boy, that's number one.
I'm going to go ahead and move to the next section of tensions, because we're actually already kind of stepping into those a little bit anyway. But the next one's timing. How did you know when it was the right time? What were the things that, Steve, you said 7 years before, you know, Steve Poe, or Stroop, you said 7 years before Steve Poe. I don't remember what your timing was in terms of knowing when to stop, but how did you know what the right timing was? Why don't we start with you, Poe?
My wife told me.
Good answer.
That's great.
That's key.
Somebody, my father-in-law used to say, if I hear a voice from heaven and it's female, I will obey. And my wife just shared with me early when I was in my 50s. She said, you know, I've made a lot of sacrifices for ministry as well. And she said, I know that you will never retire. You will always be in ministry. But she said, I would really appreciate when you turn 65 if you hand off the leadership of the church and then just do ministry. And so that's exactly what I did. So when I was 60, I told the elders that I said, in 5 years, you need to know I'll be walking out the door. So we need to start this process now. And at 62, after nothing had happened, I reminded them that we need to start working on this, guys. And so they then, through a series of events, finally got on board with that. I totally agree with Steve that I think in a large church, especially, the senior pastor needs to be the one that finds the new one, because nobody knows the heart of the church. Nobody knows the mechanics of the church. Nobody knows the DNA of the church like the existing senior pastor. And I think if that doesn't happen, I personally believe that they're headed for some bumpy roads. But anyway, so we hired my successor, and he worked under me for a year. we tried to hire from within. There just wasn't anybody. We went and found somebody. He worked for me for a year. That was a good move. If I were to do it all over again, I probably would have said maybe 18 months to 2 years, but still, it was a good move.
Yeah, I want to jump in on Steve. We did a thing where we called Josh as the next pastor. So he wasn't, and I'm sure in your same way, Steve, it wasn't a tryout time. It was, everybody knew he was the next guy. But we did a thing where we co-pastored for a year, which I've always said anything with more than one head is a freak, but you could do it for a year. And what that allowed, we had a 2-key system during that year where I couldn't make any decision without him agreeing, and he couldn't make one without me agreeing. What it did for him, because he's a real strong leader, is it kept him from making a bunch of changes in the first year that would have bit him in the rear end. And it also meant that he only had to preach half the time, so he could spend time getting to know the people, getting to know our systems and everything. So during that first year, he would come to all the meetings that I was in. Every one-on-one that I was in, he was in the room. And then about 6 months in, I would go to all those meetings with him, and he was in charge of them and everything else. It was a real luxury for him. Also recommend a book to you called The First 90 Days by Michael Watkins. It talks about the dangers of moving into a new organization and changing things too quickly and having unintended consequences. We actually read that book together. The elder board read it, and then it gave us language for that first year while we were co-leading together.
Yeah, it was about the same. That's about the same process we went through.
So Greg, was the original question about signs when you know it's time?
Yes, when you know it's time, when you feel like you're beginning to sense, okay, this is the time to make this transition.
Let me just toss in a couple things. Inner thoughts of it are more frequent. You're just starting to think about it more. Loss of passion, loss of personal health. Can't seem to catch your breath. Persistent irritability, which I kind of have every day anyway. You want to isolate or escape. Others begin dropping hints. You don't want to do another campaign or build another campus. Your spouse, marriage, or family is struggling. Or you get a kidney stone and hearing aid the same week, which is what happened to me about a month ago. But I said to our board, when 3 things converge, wouldn't it be great if I'm ready, the church is ready, and Jason is ready? And you're not going to be 100% on that, maybe about 80%. I don't think anybody's ever ready. But those are some signs that maybe it's time to start thinking about it.
That's good. I'm going to share just a couple of slides on some things that we've been learning in terms of timing, which is a little bit about what we're talking here. Let me see if I can get this to share right. Are you all seeing a pyramid looking picture here? Is everybody seeing that? Can I get a thumbs up if you're seeing it?
Yep.
Okay, perfect. So the main thing I want to talk about on this slide is this over here to the left, and the importance of thinking about timing around succession. Oftentimes, and usually when we think about succession, we think of it in terms of chronological time. When I reach a certain age, or when there's a celebration, there's a mile marker at the church. You've been around for 30 years or 40 years or whatever. Oftentimes, you've already heard a couple of guys say this. Steve said it early on. Steve Stroop said it early on. Some guys are just staying not because they feel like they still need to be there, but they need to work for another 5 years to make the financial end of it work. So I think the thing that's really important, and as we work with clients in helping to navigate this season, we're helping them to think about this too, not just the chronological time, but also kind of what the Kairos time is. I think the other thing, this next slide shows that when we think about succession and timing, we usually think primarily about this thing that's at the top, the announcement, the public handoff, all those things that happen. But really, these things down beneath are the things that need to happen, and those need to happen sooner than you really begin to move into this. At the very bottom end, talking about what is this going to look like for your spouse. Steve Poe said his wife told him. But in any case, one of the things we discover in timing of this is that oftentimes the spouse is not considered in the process. And the reality is that even if they haven't had a staff role, at some level, they've been a part of the church. They have an identity, they have a role. And so those conversations are important to have early on. And then again, before it hits public, I mean, Steve mentioned that he talked with his elders 7 years out, but this wasn't something that went public to the church for a long time. And so in this place, you're really doing the planning. You're making some of those staff transitions that you're thinking about as well. Just a couple of other thoughts here. The longer and the longer the pastor's been in place and the larger the church, the more intentional it is, more important it is to have an intentional process. And then finally, founders and near founders, there's just another layer of complexity. I think Steve Post said, it's like my daughter, I'm handing off. And so some of those things are challenging and important to think about in terms of the timing as well. I have one question that came into the chat around timing, and this was around something I think both Stroop and Bob said a little bit earlier. Did you fire staffers before the public succession announcement was made or after?
Yes.
That's right. Yeah. Fired them when they needed to be fired. I mean,
Yeah, and I also prepared staff for new roles. When the new leader comes in, my team was built around my strengths. And I knew that the new guy was going to have to build the big boys table around his strengths. So I went ahead and talked to the folks who were sitting around my table and say, guys, if you are willing to take a different role, you probably can stay on board. But if that hits your ego and you can't handle it, you might want to start looking. And I don't have any particular person I'm talking about or anything else. You need to know that you're here to serve the church and you got to serve the new guys. This guy has different strengths. He's probably going to need different people. And the truth is that some of those people said, yeah, I'm willing to serve here. One guy said, let me get this straight. I've got the same job. I'm doing the same activities and I've got the same salary, but the senior pastor is not my supervisor. And I said, that's right. He said, I'm okay. And he was able to stay because he had that flexibility, but other people, it hurt their ego. And so they left, and we were obscenely generous to those good staff members who couldn't go with the new regime. But then there were several that, we said, we're going to do you a buyout package here because, you've been here for a long, long time, but it's probably not going to work under the new situation. And so we did all three of those things.
Say a little bit more about, I guess probably it's just going to be a question for you, Bob. But, Jason was there. He'd been there for 12 years, I think. And so as you kind of navigated that transition, at kind of what point in the timing did you kind of identify that he would potentially be your successor? What was the communication that happened along the way? What were the things that happened to kind of prevent him? If he's the kind of leader that you wanted to lead this great church, what are the kinds of things that kept him from kind of being picked off by somebody else to go to be a senior pastor, perhaps earlier than you were ready to make the transition? So kind of what did that relationship look like? The timing?
I think 5 years or so, 6 years before this actually happened, when I began thinking just little thoughts about, hey, I might retire someday. I'd always had my eye on him, and he's a fantastic teacher. The leadership piece is unknown. And that's one thing I'll say. You're not going to know 100% that this person's going to succeed. Will be successful. But at some point, you just got to say, okay, he's our best bet. But I would say then when I decided, okay, this is going to happen 2 years out, and we established that, then part of the conversation was, Jason, do you think you're up to this, and do you want to do this? And he had to think about it, because that's that sweet spot of teaching. All he had to do was show up and teach, 15, 20 times a year, and I had to do everything else. I mean, what a cushy job. Not really, I'm just kidding. But so it's a both and we had to, then we put him through a series of board meetings where he had to address 4 different issues, including, setting goals, vision, how he would manage a specific conflict situation, a couple other things we put him through. But in the end, the other piece of it, I would say too, is that when we began to search for my replacement, we began to realize he's as good as it gets. We haven't found anybody in our experience that would be better than Jason and that we know as well. And so part of our own search for my replacement, his stock kept rising and rising. But in the end, he's different than me. And I've got a stronger leadership gift. He's got a lot to learn. And he's going through some, stretching, painful situations presently as we speak. I mean, that's all good. I learned most through all my painful stuff.
Yeah.
And he'll grow up.
A question here. Do you recommend vetting all possible internal candidates first or putting internal candidates into a mix with outside candidates? What wisdom do you have around the care of the internal candidates?
Yeah, I would vet everybody you have first because obviously there's less risk there.
Yeah. Okay, good. Okay,
Yeah,
let's move to the, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say that's what we did as well.
Okay, let's move to the next set of tensions here. These are around move or stay. Do I need to move to a new church, a new community, or is there a way for me and my family to stay involved in the church? Just what are each of you guys doing?
The church did as a part of taking care of me financially. One of the things they said, and this is before we knew who the pastor would be, they said, we're going to provide for you where you are going to be a consultant to our new pastor, and we're going to pay you X number of dollars a year to be available to answer any questions for him, give it any advice or anything else. But here's the key is he doesn't have to call you, and we're going to pay you whether he calls you or not. Okay. And so there was built in a 4-year consultant package. And so by virtue of that, I was kind of here. The other thing is I think if you behave yourself, you can stick around. And you don't have to be a cheerleader for the new guy, but you do have to tell people who are coming to you, complaining to you about the new guy is, hey, I'm not going to entertain that. And I have been on the public side, because COVID hit, as I handed off the baton, it was easy not to be visible. But if COVID had not hit, I think it'd been good for me to disappear physically for a while to give breathing room, not permanently, but I suggested to the elders they might want to send me on a year-long worldwide cruise, but they didn't pick up on that hint. But to do something like that, take an extended time away, and then I think you can come back and be a church member. You can come back and be a founding pastor. This interesting thing, we're 3.5 years maybe into that 4-year consulting contract, and Josh has come to me and asked if I would extend it for another 4 years. And they're providing an office for me here. It's much smaller than the one I used to have. And they're providing a 20-hour-a-week administrative assistant to help me with whatever ministry I want to be involved in the Big K Kingdom.
Yeah,
Bob?
that's awesome.
Yeah.
Go ahead. Huh?
No, go ahead, Bob. What does that look like for you?
Stroop is living the dream, man. Yeah, I think a lot of that depends on your successor and his desire to have you around. I mean, we still go to our church, but to this day, 3 years into it, every time he's referred to as a senior pastor, I get a little twinge. I get a little, that should be me, or it's just petty. I get hooked by little stuff or stuff that I see. And it's been said 90% of the success of this succession deal depends on the senior pastor who's leaving. And I agree with that. So you got to behave yourself, like Stroop said. You got to work hard at staying out of the way. My phone doesn't ring from Jason at all, pretty much. And that's fine. I have to be okay with that. I just have to continually to defer. I spoke once since I've retired. I offered to speak more, but he hasn't picked up on that for a variety of reasons. Mainly, I think it's his desire, and that's fine. And I have to be okay with that because he is the guy. We hired him, and he has to succeed, and I want him to succeed. But yeah.
Yeah, I would agree with both of them. My scenario is very similar to Steve Stroop's. I'm staying away for 7 months. They asked that I not talk to a staff member or attend a service for 7 months because I agree. I think 90% of the failures of succession in the country have to do with the existing senior pastor, so you have to be good. And I did convince them before I left, they needed to give me some kind of a title, even if I never did a thing. And so they gave me the title of legacy pastor. And he announced that on my final weekend. He got up, my successor got up and said, "Hey, good news. Steve's agreed to be our legacy pastor." And of course, it was a standing ovation, which is the point that I was trying to make to he and the elders. The congregation just needs to know you're still involved, that you still care, that you still want to be a part. And I don't know what role I'll play. We said we'd talk about that after the 7 months. I don't really care if I play any role. He's already scheduled me to preach 2 times in the second half of the year when I get back. And the idea was, I told him I wouldn't do more than 6 times a year. But yeah, I think that that's my church. My wife and I plan on attending there. And I want to be a support to him. I care about him. I love him. I want him to succeed. And so I just think it's so much of it lies on our shoulder as we step away.
That's good. I think go ahead, Steve.
I was going to say, I will say it is the responsibility of the new guy coming in to go out of his way to honor the person he's taken their place. And that's, yes, it does depend a lot. I agree with Steve and Bob. It depends a lot on how we handle the thing. You know, we could blow this thing up real easy, but it also, their part of it is to honor us. And Josh, who's here, has done a real good job. Every time he gets anywhere close to the past or anything else, he says something to honor the past and what he realizes I'm standing on the shoulders of, and he mentions me on a regular basis, and I think part of that is the confidence of the new guy.
Yeah.
Just if he's secure in it
Yes.
himself,
Yep.
and that that he feels good about who he is, that he has the freedom to do that, and so I think that's important. Anyway.
Yeah, I think a couple of things that I've seen as I've worked with churches in this process that are really helpful in that transition is just an understanding of, I call it muscle memory. So when you've been the senior pastor and you've been acting and leading in the same way for Steve, you were there 40 years. There's just stuff that you do that you probably weren't even aware of, And so you have to be so intentional to be able to think about, okay, what is it that is just I'm doing just because it's muscle memory, and what is it that I can do more intentionally that's going to help in this transition. The other thing where I've seen this go awry is when there's a lack of clarity in terms of what the expectations are on both sides. And so when I'm working with the church, we have a document we call guardrails and referees. And it's just a written document where you spell out, what are the expectations and what's off bounds and what's out of bounds and what's in bounds. And my experience has been when a church goes through that, when the senior pastor, incoming and outgoing, go through that together, and you get that clarity, there's tend to be very few problems. But if you don't have that clarity, then that's where some of the things can kind of raise their ugly head. So,
well,
Steve,
it's also easy to shoot people that you're not having to look eye to eye on. So that during that first year when we were co-pastoring together, we had a one-on-one every week. And then when I handed the baton off and I was no longer on staff, we still meet every month now. So we meet for lunch every month, and most of it's just, hey, how are you doing? Blah, 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 and that type of thing. But it just keeps that relationship. It's a rhythm that keeps that relationship in place. And I just think that's real important. It's easier to drop bombs. I will tell a funny story. When we were interviewing Josh and his wife, Josh's wife, Janice, said to Marcia, how are you going to feel when Josh starts changing everything that Steve has put into place over the last 40 years? And Marcia laughed out loud and immediately said, are you kidding? If Steve was still the pastor, he'd be changing everything that Steve put into place the last 40 years. We have to remember that. There were going to be change even if we stayed.
Yeah. Perhaps even shorter period of time than the last 4 years, right? The last 4 minutes, sometimes you guys you operate. I want to just talk a little bit more about how did you prepare your successor? And also, we have a question that came in. We'll go ahead and take that one at this point in time. Oftentimes, the congregation is the problem, not the exiting pastor. How do you prepare the congregation for the transition as well? So just any wisdom that you have around preparation, but either for the successor or for the congregation, staff, et cetera.
I think you have to constantly build up the successor to the congregation. Why, talk about why I love the guy, some of the strengths I see in him, some of the reasons that I was convinced that CJ was my successor. I need to share that with the congregation. I need to help them see those attributes, to see those character strengths in his life. And so I talked about him a lot in my messages, or some of the things I had seen him do during the week that I was so impressed with. And I just think it helps to settle the congregation to feel, because they trust me completely and totally. And so therefore, it was good for them to hear me talk like that.
That's good. Bob or Steve or Stu?
Let me go to preparation for you. I'm going back to this whole thing of the finances. The moment you know that a transition is coming up, and it ought to be 7 to 10 years that you're preparing, go ahead and project out and just say, okay, this is where I'm going to be financially based on the current reality. What do we need to change today so that changes? And one of the things that I find that's helpful is when the church will start accelerating how much money they're putting in for retirement. So let's just say the church is putting in 10% for a guy's retirement, to say, okay, for the next 10 years, we're going to add 2% to that every year for the next 2 years. And, we all know that there's a limit what you can put in pre-tax on Social Security, but there's something called the rabbi fund or a deferred compensation, and you can go beyond that. So a lot of times I hear people say, well, my church has maxed out my retirement. No, they haven't. There is no max out. You can do a deferred compensation plan where the church puts money back for a future salary above what the government will allow. The phrase that people use to describe it is the rabbi fund. It's technically just a deferred compensation plan. Ministers are the only group in the United States who can do this, and you can choose investments for that money just like you choose for your retirement, and then you take it. For example, I'm taking a 5-year payout of that rabbi fund, which will delay me having to tap my retirement for 5 more years by doing that. And so I think you look at that. The other thing that I think you can do to prepare is, like, I got to the point when at 60, I had sent my girls through college. That was paid for. I had 2 weddings that I had to pay for. I was living in the same house, so my income wasn't going up. And so in addition to the church putting more money into my retirement, I stopped taking home my raises, but instead I pushed all my raises into the rabbi fund. And that did 2 things. One is it meant for the last, and this was probably 15 years before I transitioned, for the last 15 years, I took the same salary home, which meant the cliff that I was going to fall off financially at the end was going to be less of a drop. But I was also, at the same time, by doing that, I was piling up mattresses at the bottom of the cliff. And so when I transitioned, I actually got a raise.
Yeah, this financial piece is really critical. We could talk more about that, Greg. I'll let you drive that. But in terms of preparation, just one thing that we did is I got on stage with Jason. I think it was either 6 or 8 months out, and I talked about our past. No one knew, the church didn't know we were making a succession or transitioning, but we got on stage together. First time we'd ever done this, sitting in chairs, and you guys can all look at it. It's called To the Ends of the Earth. It's way back, 3.5 years now. It's the title of the message that day was To the Ends of the Earth. And I talked about the past and looked at our past, and then Jason, I said, just as an exercise, I asked Jason to talk about our future, and he brought that to me, and I said, it was so powerful. I wanted all you to hear about it. No one knew that I was going to retire. This was like 8 months out, I believe. Then we announced 6 months out, I think. But that was kind of a setup. Seeing us together on stage, as friends and colleagues, and hearing, our voices together was really a great. It was, and so by the time I said I'm retiring and Jason's gonna be the next guy, I mean, it was like a slam dunk. I mean, but that one weekend really set us up. It's one thing we did to prepare.
Steve Poe, how about you? How'd you prepare the congregation?
Well, I told him about 3 years out that I said in 3 years, I'll be transitioning. I said, I don't know who that'll be right now, but I'll keep you updated on that process. And so I would, like, about every 6 months, just tell them where we were in the process, where we were in the journey. And then when we found the guy, obviously, of course, he worked for me for a year. So I introduced him when we hired him. I introduced him as my successor, and I said, you'll of course hear from him more. And so I would preach a month, and then he'd preach a month, and then I'd do a month, and we were every other month. And very, very similar to what Steve Stroop talked about. I mean, he was in every meeting I was in. The first quarter, he did nothing but watch. He was in all of my meetings, and he just watched, and he said, well, what's my role? And I said, your role is to build relationships, period, with the staff, with the leadership. That's all I want you to do, and preach every other month. And then the second quarter, I started letting him lead during that one, and we were both kind of co-leading. Third quarter, I left for 3 months. Went on a sabbatical and said, you're going to get to do this on your own. And then I came back for the last quarter, and we corrected all of his mistakes. And it was a teaching time for him. And yeah, so the last quarter, but I would also say a unique thing we did, Greg, that we didn't know if it was the right call. It ended up being a right call. And that is, I did the largest generosity initiative we had ever done the first quarter he was there. And people said, a lot of friends said I was crazy, and I wondered if we were, but it ended up being a home run because the congregation knew, even when I went into it, and I led the whole thing. He just observed. I led the entire thing, but they all knew.
That's great.
And so I was able while doing this generosity initiative, I was able to talk about how this was going to be handed over to him to lead out. And it worked really well.
I do think that churches who, I love that, leading that resource initiative, that really gets your people looking forward too.
Mm-hmm.
I do think people who have a teaching team have a leg up on this thing because they're already used to hearing other voices.
Yeah.
And so I would even encourage somebody's out 20 years out, that start letting other people who are not B players, but people who are A players in communication begin to share that platform so they're not as dependent upon your voice.
Yeah.
I think that's a real important part.
It's a good word. Matt Steen, you want to say just a word about chemistry staffing? And I just got one last thing I want to do after you get done before we wrap up right at the top of the hour.
I think that was a hint I'm supposed to go quick.
Yeah.
So, I appreciate that. Now, this has been great, and it's been a joy to work with Greg on this. As the theme of what our work right now is shaping up to be Successiion for 2023. This is one of the we've seen this growing wave over the last 18 months, and it's only getting bigger. And so I'm grateful that each of you are here and starting to think through the succession process. I'm grateful for Greg and the work that he does helping churches prepare for succession, because we have historically not done this well as the capital C church. I think I can say that, still get invited back, but we need to be thinking well through this. So thank you all for the work that you're doing getting ready. And Greg, thank you for caring for churches so well and helping them manage the succession process as well.
Thank you, Matt. I want to just share one last thing before we hop off. And let me put it up on screen. If you've enjoyed the conversation that you've had today with these three guys, I want to invite you to consider participating in one of my cohorts that we're doing. We're launching a second group of what I call Leadwell, Senior Pastors Finishing Well. And it's a group of up to 12 senior pastors. They are all at the 55 and up, beginning to think about what's next. Not ready to, like I said at the front end, not ready to hang it up, but they're really wanting to begin to think and prepare for that. And one of the key success factors for that are the mentors that are a part of that. Bob Merritt was a part of the first group that we launched, and this next group that we'll launch in April, Steve Stroop and Steve Poe are going to be the mentors for that group. You can see some of the details there on the screen with reference to it. If you're interested in being considered to be a part of the group, shoot me an email. You're also going to get at the end of the call, actually probably a couple hours from now, you'll get an email that has an opportunity for you to give us just a really quick eval, any feedback that you have on our show today, an opportunity for you to introduce other topics that we might want to consider. And also there will be an opportunity for you to hit a link there to, if you're interested in just setting up a coaching consulting call around Successiion. I'd love to speak with you about that, answer any further questions that you didn't get answered today. So again, we are really glad that you're with us today. And look forward to having conversations with you about Successiion as we continue to prepare the church for the next generations. Thanks so much for being with us today.